Hi, I'm Bill Bradley. Join me for a recent excerpt of American Voices. Tim Russert was legendary in the world of media and politics. He was the host of NBC's Meet the Press, and so in 2008, when he died suddenly, his viewers were shocked. They mourned, but what people didn't see was that his son Luke, who was then 22, was left to deal with the loss of his father, the loss of his best friend. Luke was searching for a way to feel whole again, find his place in the world. Luke became an NBC correspondent and an award-winning journalist. After 8 years at NBC, Luke left his job to travel the world, something he did for more than 3 years. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Look for Me There, Grieving My Father, Finding Myself. He's now the host and creative director of MSNBC Live. Luke Russert is here with me now. Luke, welcome to American Voices.
Thank you so much, Senator Bradley. It's an honor to be here, and I grew up hearing about you from my late father, and I actually had one of your campaign posters in my bedroom, the one that said academic All-American, MBA All-Star Senator, basically the guy you hated in high school. So it's a good one.
Yeah, that was from the Iowa caucuses. As a matter of fact, I have that on my wall right here in my office.
It's a good one. It's a good one. So it's an honor.
Well, listen, as our listeners know, at the end of each episode of American Voices, we hear from an author who talks about his favorite place or sound in America. I don't know if you know, but your father was on American Voices, and for his favorite sound, he mentioned you. I'd like to play that bit for you right now.
This is Tim Russert. My favorite sound in America is a baby's laughter. I'm someone who really worked hard all my life and went to school and didn't have much time to think about families or children. And if I was on an airplane and someone was struggling with a baby or babies, I considered it more of an inconvenience than anything else. Until I got married and had my son at age 35. And from that day forward, I cannot walk down a street or in a church or in a grocery store or on an airplane without wanting desperately to hear the laughter of a baby. It just changes my spirit. It warms my heart and my soul. I have a little trick I use with all my nieces and nephews, and now my dad's first great-grandson, and that is if I can scoop up a baby and take their little belly and put it on top of my head and twist my head, they will laugh uproariously. You can take the worst curmudgeon on the face of the earth, and I dare say, show them a baby laughing, and it just absolutely takes control of them and puts a smile on their face. It's universal. It's my favorite sound in America. It's my favorite sound in the world.
So that's a very powerful statement.
Yeah.
In that clip, you heard how much he loved you, how much just being your father changed him. Tell me about that time in 2008 and how you first went about dealing, or perhaps not dealing, with grief.
Well, I was so moved by the clip you just shared because I think it shows the degree to how grounded my father was. And that was the quality I loved the most about him, is that despite the fact that he was considered so famous and so important, he never really let it get to his head. And he gave me this beautiful gift, which was the gift of unstructured time. You know, even though he was the busiest person I ever knew, he always had time for me. And I think it's reflected in that clip when you hear the sound of the laughter of a child is sort of what he's drawn to. It speaks to what he really saw as the important things in life, which is he always believed that at the end of his days that he would be judged more so than anything on what kind of father he was, more so than any other professional accolades that he got. So it was very sweet to hear that. You know, that day in June 13th, 2008, which I write about as the most difficult day of my life, I think one thing that I didn't realize at the age of 22 was just how significant having my rock, having my guiding light, just disappearing in a split second was. And as a young man, you're taught to go down into reservoirs of strength and to be strong and to put on a strong face and be there for your family. And I saw my responsibility, my duty was to really preserve my father's legacy and do the best that I could to make him proud and to make him feel on the other side that things were taken care of. And it took me a long time to realize that in the process of doing that, I never really fully did a thorough self examination. There was never an internal diagnostic check. I did what a lot of young men do, which is store and ignore, and threw myself into work, threw myself into my 20s, and tried to, for a long time, run away from processing grief. And that's why I hit on in the book and how it's a complex journey for everybody. There's really no set template that works. It's
Mm.
something you really have to do on your own and you have to come to. And there's people who are very helpful along the way. But for me, I spent a long time running away from processing the grief of losing my father because I felt that if I ever did it, I would have to truly admit that he was gone. And it was easier just sort of plowing through, white knuckling.
Hmm. So you went to work for NBC, working hard, as Russerts do. And then former Speaker John Boehner starts giving you advice. Republican Speaker John Boehner. What did he tell you? How do you feel about it?
So I'd been on Capitol Hill at that point for about 7 years, and I really did love the job. As you can recall from your time in Congress, it's infectious.
And you were doing what?
And I was covering Congress, specifically the House for NBC News and MSNBC
Mm-hmm.
as a reporter, and I enjoyed it. And I was one of those weirdos that I liked going to those subcommittee hearings to get different markups and learn about things that most people would never know. How many sea bass would be allowed to be caught off the shores of Cape Cod in the fiscal year 2011, right? So things like that I found randomly interesting. But Speaker John Boehner in the spring of 2015, he saw me in the hallway and he said, "Hey, I want to talk to you. Come by my office." And I thought he was upset about political coverage. I thought that he was going to chew me out about some stories that we had done about the problems he was having with the Tea Party and his conservative flank. And I walked into his office and he was smoking a cigarette and reading Golf Digest. And he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, you're the Speaker of the House. You invited me into your office. What do you mean? What am I doing here? I'm going to show up. I'm a junior reporter. I obviously come with the Speaker beckons." And he goes, "No, what are you doing here on Capitol Hill?" And Boehner, like my father, had been educated by the Jesuits, and I felt it was like a Jesuit mind game question. What are you doing here?
Yeah,
And he
right.
said, "No, right." He goes, "No, I've seen you on Capitol Hill." He goes, "You've been here a while and you're about to turn 30. And, I've seen a lot of people come up here 10 years, turns into 20, turns into 30, 40, 50 years, and they might be here in Washington. And there's always a next bill. There's always a next election. There's always a gravy train. And it's a very transactional place. So you would be well suited to really sit back and figure out if this is what you want to do, or maybe take some time and see what else the world has to offer, what the country has to offer. Maybe learn a different skill aside from just being a political swamp creature." And it was an amazing conversation because there had been something in my head that had been saying, "Is this who you are? Or is this what you feel you have to be to honor your father?" And then I asked myself a very uncomfortable question, which was, who are you, Luke, beyond the last name? Who are you beyond this culture of privilege in Washington that you grew up in? And how do you measure yourself up against the world or other things? So when someone like John Boehner said that, who literally and figuratively was on the top of the hill and was saying the view is not it's all cracked up to be, maybe take a moment for yourself. It was a needed perspective. I took his advice and I ended up going on a journey, which I thought was going to be 6 months and ended up being about 3 years over 6 continents and 67 plus countries. But I learned a lot about myself and I was able to process grief. So I would
Hmm.
say it was worth it.
So you owe a lot to John Boehner.
I do. And I think sometimes in this world, we have to be very mindful of who our messengers are. And I think the reason why Boehner was able to connect with me was because he was very similar to my father in the sense that he grew up in a working class Catholic family. He was the first member of his family to go to college. Like my dad, he paid for his tuition by doing odd jobs. He was a janitor at Xavier University in Cincinnati. So he was somebody who had a similar upbringing, albeit different politics, but a similar upbringing, and was kind of a perfect messenger in a sense, which is, hey, I, like your father, worked very hard to get where I am, but I'm telling you, it's okay to use your position and to use the privileges you have available to you to take a moment and really figure out what it is you want from this life.
And so you started traveling, extended almost 3 years. You did it to get away from the pressure, have some time for self-discovery. It proved to be the right antidote, right?
It was. And, it's very interesting. For the first 30 years of my life, I lived a pretty sheltered life. I had a lot of rich experiences in America. I was well traveled in the country, and I had worked, since the age of 14 in the summers and all types of jobs. So I had a lot of exposure to the American existence, but I didn't have much of a global exposure. I mean, that had always been something that didn't sit well with my mother. She was a Peace Corps volunteer before she became an investigative reporter and well known at Vanity Fair and Newsweek and everything. She'd always said to me, Luke, I really was able to understand myself when I was measuring myself up against the world in a place where I barely knew the language, I barely knew the culture, and I really had to see what I was made of. And you'd be well served to have those types of experiences. So, really, at her behest, I started traveling mainly to gain a new perspective and to gain new experience. But as I traveled, I began to realize how right she was. But I started my travels in Latin America, and then that took me over eventually to Asia. And then I did Africa. I did a lot of places in Europe and the Middle East. And it was really a global journey where became more in tune with my faith. I became more in tune with how the world works, and really just saw the beauty of the global family, which I think is something that's often missed. We often talk about our divisions, but as you've seen in your own travels, it's cliche, but it's very true. We are way more similar than we are different.
Right.
People's inclinations are to help one another.
But let me try to give our listeners a sense of the pressure that you felt that kind of pushed you in this direction. I mean, you're the son of two veteran journalists, and it can be difficult, as you have expressed. In your book, in your travels, when you meet someone who talks about love, you write, "The women I'd ever given a chance to were deliberate and fraught with thought. Could she handle official Washington with its formal events, celebrations, and galas? Could she shake hands correctly? Could she live up to family expectations? Could she handle the media spotlight? If so, what about the pressure put on her by DC society that ranked power couples like sports teams? How could she deal with the ever-prying eyes everywhere, connected to toxic people who, once your back is turned, will happily rip you and your loved ones to shreds?" Wow.
What you bring up there is something that really, unfortunately, dominated my 20s. And I didn't realize until I began to travel, until I met other people, that there were things out there in this world as true love, that you love someone for who they are. You love somebody for how they make you feel. And you don't worry about how they present themselves to a diplomat or a senator or a president, that you like them for who they are. And it's a shame to admit that in my 20s, I was more focused on, okay, do they maintain this sort of balance with me and present well? But what a terrible way to think. And I think traveling gave me that perspective that ultimately, at the end of the day, you want to be with someone who not only makes you happy, but you have a genuine attraction for, and is not just checking off boxes or trying to fit into a role. And unfortunately, in society, can do that to you.
Tell me about some of those moments in your travels that gave you some breathing room, that made your voice the one you listened to, as opposed to all the other voices in your head imagining other people's expectations of you.
I think one of the things I realized when I began to travel was there's just such immense beauty in the world, and life is very short. And I would often think of my father dying at 58 and all the things that he was not able to see. And one story that's actually not in the book, but it's one that I often think about, is there is some there's something going on back at home, and there was some fallout at NBC about something, and all these people were tweeting at me and asking me questions and emails and blah blah blah. And I was on a ski lift in Patagonia just to take in the sights, not to ski, just sort of going up this hill, and there's this beautiful vista of Patagonia and the striking mountains and the glaciers and the fresh air and that sound of water that you hear amongst glaciers. And I remember I just turned off my phone and I go, there is nothing more important than this right now. All of those other controversies, all those other problems will always exist, but this beautiful nature in this moment is what is most important. And I began to, in that moment, be much more perceptive of things and things that really truly matter. Which honestly I think is so hard now because our society with notifications and alerts, it's really formulated to take up as much of your attention as possible. But there's those special moments where you have to take measure of how beautiful nature is, or how beautiful even a city is, or a conversation is, or a person is, and really put the rest of your life on hold to focus on what's important in that moment that you're never going to have again. And that was something I really did learn while traveling. One other one that's really quick, I'll just tell you, that I really started to do once I began into travel is I had done this in the United States, and whenever I traveled to cover political stories, I would always try to find a dive bar in a specific city and just sort of talk to people, which I saw in your movie you're guilty of too. You like to go into cafes and diners and chat people up. And I would just do that in different countries and kind of find these funky, far and away places. And I just felt such a kinship with those souls, and getting to know, some a dairy farmer in New Zealand, or a guy who ran a boat tour company in Thailand, or a Muslim guy who said, "Don't tell anyone that I'm drinking."
So, Luke, how would you get to know them? You just start up a conversation?
Start up a conversation. A lot of times it's in broken English, right? Or you could use Google Translate, which was a lot of fun. And I think a lot of people around the world, they like to open up to complete strangers, especially when there's a different country involved. And then a lot of times, if there was ever a tour guide, I would really try to get to know them, and often they would introduce me to a family member or a friend, and it would take off from
Yeah.
there. So it was great.
It always starts from one person reaching out to another.
Yes, and lifting them up.
Yeah. And so, listen, so here are all these experiences on the road around the world. How did it affect your grief?
So it's a wonderful question. When I started to travel, I realized there were certain moments where I would break down, or there were certain moments where I wouldn't feel whole. And unlike when I was working so hard in my 20s and would just have these experiences, but chalk it up to maybe I was anxious, or maybe I was just having a bad day, as I traveled and these would come up, I actually had the resolve to sit in it and to begin to try to process it, begin to try to feel it. And then I'd have these moments where rainbows would appear. And quick sidebar, the reason why rainbows are important is when my father was his casket was essentially coming out of the church. And then later on, at a memorial service for him at the Kennedy Center, one of his favorite songs that we played was "Somewhere Over the Rainbow." And lo and behold, on the day that he was buried, there was a big rainbow over Washington. So I've always said, yeah, that my father knew how to make an exit or an entrance, and that was him there. So I would see rainbows around the world, and when I would see those rainbows, I would tear up and I would choke up, and I would just think about how much I missed the guy, and how much I wanted him there, how much I needed his counsel, how much I could have been better had he been there to be able to guide me and help me. But eventually I realized that he was still there, and that he had prepared me very well for these moments, and that eventually I had to summon the courage and talk to him, and feel him, and realize that even though he's not physically present, he always walks with me. And it
Hmm.
took a while to get there, but ultimately, what I came to realize traveling is that, when our lost loved ones are brought up, um, much better if we smile than if we cry. Because I think if they had the opportunity to talk to us one more time, they would say, "Hey, I'm here. I'm with you. Don't be upset. Don't let me passing stunt you. You still have a chance to make your mark in this life. Take advantage of
Mm-hmm.
it. Go for it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm right behind you. I support you. You do what makes you happy. You do with something that makes you who you are." And I was able to get to that place through the travel.
There are also difficult moments in your travels. First, it's freeing, but then you start to feel lost. Your mother wins an Emmy. Now you're not only comparing yourself to your father, but you're comparing yourself to the person you used to be.
Yeah.
You write, at the red carpet, a woman wearing a headset grabs Mom by the arm. Maureen, welcome, and leads her to the walkway. The woman makes no eye contact with me. I think back to the life I once led. I walked red carpets once. I even took Oscar-nominated actress Anna Kendrick to the ritzy White House Correspondents' Dinner when I was 24. An up-and-coming actress and an up-and-coming broadcast journalist. Now she's A-list, and well, I'm a past life. That's what you write.
Yeah. And I think sometimes in those moments where you don't have the self-confidence, and I think at that time I had been traveling for about 2.5 years, and with a lot of freedom comes somewhat of a danger at times, which is that you can really hang yourself with all the freedom, the line of freedom that you have. It can almost be like a noose. And at that moment, I was very much down because I felt that all this privilege, all these opportunities that I had, did I do enough with them? And here my mother was having all this success, very well deserved. And I was basically just sort of behind her holding her bag, and an afterthought. And it hit me kind of hard at that moment. And it made me question a lot about, did I make the right decisions in life? And was this experience traveling just to sort of exercise in vanity? Was it escapism? I didn't know the answer to that. But I knew at that moment that I was going to be more determined and more focused to figure it out. And that's what really led me to making a decision to not only become more disciplined at that stage of my life, but also really dedicate myself to writing, because I knew the journals I had kept along the way, I knew they were telling a story.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that I had to get into that and try to do something that would benefit others.
There's more of my conversation with Luke Russert coming up next. Plus, life in Larsen Bay, Alaska. Josh Marishich is a fourth-generation fisherman.
And the whale just kind of looked at us and then just gently descended down into the water and left. And it's just those experiences that you can't have very many other places.
You're listening to American Voices. I'm Bill Bradley. Stay with us. I'm Bill Bradley. We're back now on American Voices. We're continuing my conversation with Luke Russert. He's an award-winning journalist and son of Tim Russert. His book is called Look for Me There, Grieving My Father, Finding Myself. So, Luke, how did you eventually come to a place of feeling a little less lost?
That's a really hard journey, because I think in my case, I had a lot of self-loathing. And what I eventually came to realize was there was a reason as to why I had gone on this journey. And the woman who's now my fiance, she asked me a question when I was thinking about writing a book. And she said, you had all these incredible experiences. You obviously learned a great deal, but why should anyone care about what you're writing about? I mean, do you have a good answer for that? And it's, writing a book is a little egotistical, right? It is saying, I have something to say and you should pay your money to hear it, right? And I had an answer that came right off the top of my head very quickly, which is that I don't care if this book ends up in a gas station bargain book bin. If it sells a few copies and one kid who lost their dad reads it and feels a little less lost, then I've done my job. And I found a sense of purpose in that. And
Hmm.
that was what drove me through the writing process. And that was what drove me going forward, which is that I've had the time, I've had this gift and privilege of time that a lot of people who grieve do not have. And what have I learned with this time that's been afforded to me? And I need to tell that story. And that's what I did. But it took a long time to get there because there was a lot of moments on that journey where, I didn't know why me, or I didn't know what I was necessarily learning about myself in the given moment. It took a review process to get there.
And there were moments when you start to feel your father's presence, that he's with you and he wants you to be happy.
Yes, there's a very important moment, and that was in Jerusalem. And the Holy Land was the place that I waited to visit till the end of my travels. And it had always nagged at me that I had not gone there. And I began to write the book out in San Francisco at my grandmother's old apartment. And I would take these walks every day after hours of writing to sort of clear my head. And there is this little free library on one of the corners where people in the neighborhood would put books, take one, leave one, etc. And I saw this book about the Middle East, and I said, "Oh man, that's probably a sign I really need to go to the Middle East. I really need to go to the Holy Land." And right next to that book, randomly, was a copy of my father's book, Big Russ and Me, that someone had left in there. That was signed actually, which I joked to him when I on the walk. I said, "Hey, Dad, they don't care about you enough. They would give away a signed copy." But I I saw that as okay, you got to go to the Holy Land, and I ended up going on that trip, and I went to Jerusalem, and I actually went to the tomb of Christ at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it was there where in a deep, profound moment of prayer, I really asked for guidance about why me? What is my role here? What is my purpose in this world? And essentially hear this voice in my head, which is, you're her. Just go forward and notice things and notice things and notice things. I said, well, come on, that's not a real answer. What am I supposed to notice? And as I left the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there is a guy selling yarmulkes right on the street, and there in the middle was a Buffalo Bills yarmulke. And my father's from South Buffalo, was a huge Buffalo Bills fan, and I knew that was my dad. So I got the Buffalo Bills yarmulke, and I went down to the Wailing Wall, and then I kind of just sat there, and I had this epiphany, and that was that um, no matter what I chose to do in this life, my father would love me. That I had been so busy living for him that I hadn't been living enough for myself. And in that moment, I felt that he had basically said, I will love you and support you no matter what you do. And don't spend your whole life just, preserving my legacy. That's a nice part of it, but go off and do your own thing. And it was almost like the permission that I needed in that moment, and that's
Mm.
where I really felt him the strongest and really, really showed himself, a Buffalo Bills yarmulke in the streets of Jerusalem.
Because your father will always be with you because your father is a part of you.
And you carry the lessons and you carry the moments. And
Mhm.
one of the things one of my readers said to me, which I truly do believe, is you can talk to your lost loved ones. You can imagine what they would say to you. You can get into that meditative space where you hear their voice, you remember their mannerisms, you remember how they conducted themselves, and you can really dig deep and say, hey, what would you recommend in this situation? And a lot of the times I get to a place of peace from it.
Well, listen, now you're back at NBC as host and creator of MSNBC Live. When it comes to attitudes toward work or success, what changes do you see in yourself this time around?
I think I'm so much more mature and so much more confident in myself now than I was in my 20s. And I really do realize the value in setting aside time for yourself so that you feel whole and that your mental health is strong. And I also think the most important thing from a media standpoint is we live in such a fractured society. We live in a society where there's so much noise, and anything that I can do to try and remind people that, you might disagree with someone, but you don't have to hate someone on the other side. And you might not necessarily understand an issue, but understand that there are ways to solve these complex problems if we come together. It doesn't have to be as hyper partisan. And I just try to remind myself of that. I try to maintain a real sense of civility. I think we live in a society where snarkiness is just overcome to a point where people are afraid to even speak up at times because they just don't want to be vilified. So I really put that as important currency that we really have to maintain a sense of civility and really focus on the issues that matter and try to come to a place where we make people's lives a little bit easier if they're better informed.
So at the end of the day, was it time that allowed you to process the grief?
I think it was a combination of factors, but I think most importantly, it was that time to be able to live inside that grief and sit inside that grief in a manner of which, if you throw yourself into hard work or you throw yourself into societal expectations and obligations, it's very easy just to forget about it. And I got a lot of letters from people in their 60s, their 70s, 80s, even 90s. I mean, I had a 97-year-old grandmother write me about how she read my book and was finally able to process the grief of losing her mom, that had
Hmm.
been on her conscience for decades and something that she had never been able to do. And what I came to realize was that the reason I was able to do that and to help people like that was because I had the time to explore all the different responses I had to the moment and try to understand them and not just sort of get on with it as so many people are forced to do because of circumstances or just choose to do because it's easier. And also, if I give myself any credit, it's that I got to a place of being vulnerable and I was okay to be vulnerable. It's not easy, especially as a young man in America, to be vulnerable, but from vulnerability came a lot of clarity. And I'm very thankful for that.
Well, Luke, listen, I want to thank you for sharing your story with us. In your book, you write the following: thank you to all the readers who made this author feel a little less lost. While grief is incredibly lonely, Luke, you found a way to connect yourself with others. I just admire that a lot.
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be on the show with you. And my parents are great admirers of yours. So I grew up hearing all the stories. And my dad at one point even said, Senator Bradley used to tie his hand behind his back to learn how to shoot free throws. So you should do the same thing. But I never quite went that extreme.
Well, that's okay. I forgive you, Luke.
Thank you.
Okay. To find out more, visit us on Facebook. Our Facebook page is American Voices with Senator Bill Bradley. We're also now on Instagram. Hope you check us out there too. The Instagram page is Bill Bradley on Sirius XM. Write me your thoughts on anything you've heard today and follow us. Thank you for listening to American Voices here on my YouTube channel. For more interviews celebrating the goodness and creativity of the American people, click the subscribe button below.